So we learned a lot about components with the data property, which should be a function, with the fact that we shall only have one root element in our component template, and with the, methods of registering our component, globally like this, and locally with the component's property. I want to do this here now too, and I want to connect our components with some other things we learned earlier. Let me create a new Vue file here. I'll name it server status.vue. This is kind of the file naming convention we currently use, by the way. You give your Vue components this naming where you start with a capital character, and then you have, this casing where each subword in your title, in your name, also begins with a capital character like status here. This will create our service status component, though of course this file name is totally irrelevant for the selector you choose to use in the end, because you set up these selectors like this in the Vue component method or as a string in the component's property for local components anyways. So in the service status component, I'll copy my code from the home component, and here I basically want to use the exact same status, or the same setup. I have my template where I have the service status, which I can change with a button. But now let's imagine our application manages the state of several servers, and so we want to be able to track the state of each server and change it. So in the home component, I will no longer output the server status. I will no longer manage the data here. Instead, here I will only want to loop through all my servers I got. And for this, I need a for loop, but I also need to have access to the service status component. Now, I could register service status globally, but here I want to do this locally. So I'll add the components method, and here I set up a key as a string, and I'll name it app server status. Therefore, I will rename my global component here so that I don't get problems, which I will simply name app servers. Also adjust app servers here in the template, of course, to use this new selector we set up here globally. And then in the home component, I have my local app server status selector, and I want to refer to the component in the server status.vue file. Well, for this, I need to import it here in this script tag, which of course is possible here too. That's normal JavaScript code. And I can use this import syntax since we're using ES6, since our project will compile to ES5 and allows us to use features like this, which is very handy to split up the file or the project over multiple files. So here I will then import server status, and the name here is totally up to you again. We don't imply a name here when we export just a default, but it makes sense to use the file name so that you easily see where this is coming from. And then it is from /service-status.vue file. Now here I simply assign the object we're importing from there to the selector, and therefore I can now use app server status in my template. But as I said, I want to loop through this and have multiple servers. No problem. I can use v-for and simply loop through it by saying server in 5 to loop from 0 to 5, if you remember this. But with this setup, we would get an error because even though we only have one element here in our code, this will result in 5 elements in the end. So we would have, again, more than one root element. So again, wrap it inside a div to have valid code here. And with that, if you hit Ctrl S and save this, it should recompile. And once this reloads here, you should see all these servers. As a side note, if you have problems with it reloading, always feel free to cancel this process with Ctrl C and rerun npm run dev. So now we got all our servers which we can switch manually. And now we're using both a global, the app servers home component, and a local component here. And with that, you saw how you can use them, create them in single files. With the single file setup, important here, keep in mind you have to have one root element. You also saw how to export them with export default and import them in other files due to us using ES6, which is required for this whole multi-file setup. And you saw how to register them both globally and locally. You also saw how to use them with v-for, because you can use your newly created components like normal HTML tags. You can use them with v-for, with v-if, all the things we learned. And with that, I'd say it's time to practice this.